Good afternoon, colleagues. This is meeting number 106 of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts for Tuesday, June 19th, 2018. And we are here this afternoon in consideration of the message of the Auditor General in the 2018 Spring Report. I would again remind each one of us that we are televised today, and so I would encourage you to put your phones, those in the audience and staff and members of the committee, to put your phones on silence or vibrate so it disturbs the meeting less. We are honoured to once again have with us this afternoon Mr. Michael Ferguson, our Auditor General of Canada. And before we proceed, colleagues, in what may be our last meeting before summer recess, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our Auditor General for his many appearances before committee during the last 6 months of this year and last fall. Your reports and the many recommendations that you've made in those reports go a very long way in improving many aspects of the federal government's programs and policies. And we all do very much appreciate your good work and your willingness to work with this committee. I would also like to thank our clerk and our two analysts for the tremendous job that they have done and keeping us on track and providing sage advice and producing quality reports that we can all be proud of. And now to Mr. Ferguson, we turn the time to you for some introductory remarks, if you have some, and we look forward to them, and we will then go into our regular rounds of questioning. Mr. Ferguson, our Auditor General.
Thank you. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie.
Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the message from the Auditor General of Canada that I included as part of our Spring 2018 reports. I am familiar with the testimony of the Clerk of the Privy Council when he appeared before this committee last week. First, I would like to say that I agree with the Clerk that he and I have had many fruitful, direct, honest, and respectful conversations about our work. The frankness of this public conversation won't change that. Also, as he said, we were able to work together to achieve a mutually acceptable order in Council that clarifies our right to access information. Also, I would like to sincerely thank him for that. I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of the Public Accounts Committee that facilitated our ability to arrive at a mutually acceptable solution.
My message as an opinion piece. He's correct. The message does express my opinion that we need to find the root cause of the Phoenix Project failure and other incomprehensible failures. It's an opinion piece based on my almost 7 years as Auditor General of Canada, 40 years of performance audits done by our office, and the fact that all the government's controls did not prevent the Phoenix failure from happening. The message was motivated by my profound belief that the federal government has important services that people in Canada need and rely on, and that the federal government has hard-working civil servants who are dedicated to the work they do. In that message, I pointed to the fact that the Canadian Civil Service is ready and willing to do the heavy lifting to improve the culture. In my opinion, Phoenix has tarnished the reputation of the federal government, both at the political level and at the civil servant level. Therefore, we all need to look deeper to understand how Phoenix and other incomprehensible failures happened, what were the root causes, and we need to prevent any more from happening in the future. J'ai dit dans mon message.
In my message, I said that the bottom line is that a change in the culture of the federal government will be the best hope to prevent incomprehensible failures in the future. I described aspects of the culture that, in my opinion, may have contributed to Phoenix. I admit in the message I may not have captured everything in my description of the culture. People will disagree with some, or maybe even all of my description. However, there has to be a conversation about the culture of government. As I said in my message, Phoenix failed thoroughly in an environment that has a management accountability framework, risk management policies, program evaluations, internal audit groups, departmental audit committees, accounting officers, departmental plans, departmental performance reports, pay for performance compensation, and audits by the Office of the Auditor General. I believe that it would be too simplistic to think that just adding a few more rules or another policy will, this time, prevent any incomprehensible failures.
The message because I expected that people would feel that the performance audit we did on building and implementing the Phoenix Pay system did not adequately answer the question of who was to blame for Phoenix and how it could have been possible. And that took me to the need to explore the question of how the government's culture enabled Phoenix. So I described some aspects of the culture that, in my opinion, contribute to problems. For example, policies are sometimes applied as cover to avoid blame. There is reverence for checking boxes. There has been an erosion of deputy minister influence, partly because of the short tenure of deputy ministers. Ministers tend not to get excited by back office administration projects, and so they expect the budgets and timelines of those projects to be strictly managed. Governments have tried to stay in the safe space of administering payments instead of being an active partner with Indigenous people to improve outcomes. The measure of success on Indigenous programs has become the amount of money spent rather than improved outcomes. And compliance with all government rules has become impossible because of their sheer volume. Monsieur le Président, je ne voulais pas dire...
Mr. Chair, my message was not intended to say that I had the answer to the culture issues. In fact, I said that I do not have a set of instructions to deal with the issue. My message was intended to start a conversation about how government culture contributed to the Phoenix failure. The message does reflect my opinion, and as such, I am prepared that some people will say that it is just his opinion. But I stand by it, and I believe that I said what was needed to be said, whether people agree with it or not.
I sincerely want to thank the Public Accounts Committee for being an early participant in this culture conversation. I'm now ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. We appreciate the work and your straightforward message today. I think we're all reminded that you are an officer of Parliament and you report to Parliament. The clerk who was here is a very important officer who reports to Cabinet and is the chief civil servant, and so there's two different responsibilities, and so we appreciate you bringing this message to Parliament. We'll now go to the first round of questioning, and Monsieur Massé, vous avez 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson, for being with us once again today to talk about Chapter 0 of your message. Obviously, as you know, this report created a lot of waves, and public servants have reacted. They were criticized, and the upper management saw your report as criticism, and I'm sorry, but the message that you shared, because of my perspective and background and experience, I do not share your opinion. I saw with my own eyes the creation of programs and services, the modernization of legislation that has enabled many Canadians throughout the country to receive quality services thanks to many public servants, because they want to serve Canadians well. There have been many successes that we can mention. Throughout my career, I can think of various successful projects within the Translation Bureau, the Department of Justice, document imaging. There are all sorts of successes, such as modernization of programs for farmers. The last time I mentioned the modernization process that helped to modernize pensions for the public service. So I think it's several hundred public servants that receive their pensions regularly. So is everything perfect? Obviously not. Things can always be made better. It is clear in your message that you focused on some components. Phoenix, obviously, and the implementation of Phoenix, well, it was clearly a failure. And the clerk, when he came before our committee, he used the term that I used in my discussion with you. He talked about a perfect storm in English. And yes, it was a perfect storm. In my opinion, this storm was created by the previous government's refusal to accept that the costs to implement Phoenix properly should have been roughly $300 million instead of the $150 million. So the minister, he went to see his colleagues and he said the cost to implement Phoenix is higher than what we had evaluated for various reasons. But they didn't obtain the additional funding, and I know that the public servants were probably told, sorry, you're going to have to work with the budget that you have, and you'll have to deliver the project on budget, on time. Everything has to be done. And the perfect storm also included 40-year-old technology and massive layoffs of pay experts. More than 700 people were laid off. We're also talking about centralization in Miramichi of a large number of employees who at the time didn't have the necessary experience to work on a centralization project like this one. They did a good job, and they're still doing a good job with the tools they have. So for me, this was a perfect storm that was generated, once again, by a budget issue, which was the source of all this. I believe you said that it's important to ensure that public servants and upper management speak truth to power. I think public servants did speak truth to power, but people have a short memory, and they weren't listened to. I think that's at the crux of this issue here. I'm convinced that people who were in power at the time said, you have to do this project on budget, on time, and you have to make sure you deliver the goods. However, I agree with what the clerk said. Changes have to be made. When you have 27 collective agreements, when there are 79 different classifications, and there are various pay levels, it's very complex. So if you want Phoenix to be a success in the future, well, we have to look at the problem, and we're going to find solutions. We're committed to that because it's important for public servants. They all deserve to be paid the right amount at the right time. However, once again, improvements can be made, and I think this will involve a simplification of the whole classification process if we want to make sure we provide better pay service. However, I've taken a lot of time, I'm sorry. I have a minute left. I would like to hear what you have to say about your recommendations. If you had a recommendation to make in your message to further improve services we provide to Canadians, if there was one aspect that you'd like the government to really focus on, what would it be? That's the same message, the message I've repeated often. We really have to focus on results, on outcomes and targets. I understand, I agree that the federal government public servants, they take their work very seriously. They're working really hard for Canadians. I understand that. But it's also important for the government to make sure that there's a culture in place that allows the job to get done properly. And once again, it's the same issue here. With all the rules that were in place at the time, how could this be possible that we've had such an incomprehensible failure such as Phoenix? And the answer to this question, it's more than just it's important to have other rules or policies. It's important to examine the culture aspect of this issue. And if there's any changes to be made to this culture, we have to look at them. Thank you.
To the opposition side, Mr. Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Auditor General, for coming today and presenting, also providing the message in the report. I've already been on the record of saying that I thought that this message was incredibly strong. I think it sets a tone to all departments within the Government of Canada that we need to move, to, as you said, to a results and outcomes, targets focused culture that doesn't exist. And there's things that exist in that place. You outlined the amount of money spent seems to be a measurable, or how good the press conference or Twitter ad or Facebook message is that comes out of it from whatever minister it is. And I must say, it wasn't just a single government that you were talking about. This is a culture that has been perhaps pervasive over a number of years. But I have to take serious concern, perhaps serious concern with the comments that were just brought by my colleague Remy Massé when he says it's a perfect storm. When you say it's a perfect storm and it's just a bunch of things that happen, it was a perfect storm, that reduces our ability to find accountability. And it basically says, it was a perfect storm, everything that could go wrong went wrong, so you know what, better luck next time. And that is, I do not believe that's what Canadians are looking for. And more important than that, I don't believe that the Canadian public servants who were impacted so terribly around Christmas time and before and after, I don't think that they feel that way about this. The other thing I want to take exception to is the comments that, and look, it was in translation, but I think this is pretty easy. I know that they were probably. I don't think that you can say I know and they were probably in the same sentence to define what happened or didn't happen in relation to either requests for funding to and from with a minister 6 years ago. It's either probably or I know. There's no, you can't have both of those in the same sentence. And so it's really important that we stick directly to the facts. Here's a fact. 2 weeks before this went live, there was a report that had been commissioned earlier by, I believe, and if you can confirm this, Mr. Auditor General, by Scott Bryson, Treasury Board Secretary. That report was finally given to the Treasury Board 2 weeks in advance of Phoenix going live. Is that correct?
Are you referring to the Gartner report?
Yes, sir.
So my understanding is the Gartner report was commissioned, yes, in December, I believe, of 2015, and it was completed in February of 2016, just before Phoenix went live.
So you had access to that report in putting this second report on Phoenix together. The question I have for you is, who had access to that report?
So I wouldn't be able to give you a complete list. I'd have to go back, but you know, the report was prepared by Treasury Board. My understanding is Treasury Board gave it to the project executives responsible for the Phoenix project. Who saw it within Treasury Board or exactly, you know, everybody that saw it, I wouldn't know that. I just know sort of the general of it, that it was commissioned by Treasury Board and they gave it to the project executives.
Would this Treasury report, or did you have any evidence of this Treasury report actually making it to any political staff or to politicians themselves?
Again, once things get behind the doors of what goes to ministers, and then we get into that world of cabinet confidence that we can't get into. So I don't know. I don't know how that would have been distributed in terms of, you know, minister or minister's political staff. I wouldn't know that.
So we have a report that was delivered 2 weeks before Phoenix went live that basically said there's some major problems here. And lo and behold, Phoenix goes live, and we don't have a single signature documented anywhere from the minister saying it's okay to go, I'm signing off on this.
We couldn't find any documentation of the approval to go live with Phoenix.
So when I submit a $100 expense to the taxpayers of Canada, I have to sign off on it. When our public servants, the same ones who were affected so severely and work so hard for us, submit a tiny expense within their departments, they have to sign off on it. But nobody signed off on what appears to be at least a $500 million miss, could be much, much higher than that by the time that we're done. I think we're talking about expenses in the neighborhood of $1 billion to have the system up and running to the satisfaction of what it was hoping to do at the outset.
So that's one of the fundamental things that you expect to find when a new IT system is put in place. You expect to see the sign-off by the system owner saying that the system is ready to go into production. We couldn't find that type of documentation in the case of Phoenix.
So, Mr. Auditor General, obviously the Clerk of Privy Council had perhaps some words that did not fall in line with what your message was. Some of it I think he took exception with, some of it he said he actually agreed with. But when looking at the words incomprehensible failure, he certainly took exception with that. I think you've said, yes, it was an opinion related to the culture. You've said that here today. This is an opinion based on years and years of service in your field, years and years of service to the people of Canada. Is it not an incomprehensible failure that this system was launched without a signatory representing the minister or the minister themselves?
Well, I don't know about the minister per se, but certainly you would expect to find, as I say, it's just a normal practice in putting an IT system in place, that there would be a signature from the system owner. And I think perhaps they had some difficulty in defining the system owner, but in this case you would have expected that to have come directly from Public Services and Procurement Canada, that there would have been a sign-off saying this system is ready to go. That's one aspect of the many different things that we found, including, you know, cancelling the pilot project, not doing all of the testing, going ahead even though they realized that the Miramichi Pay Centre was not ready. All of those things combined are what make the Phoenix an incomprehensible failure. Again, it's very comprehensible to understand all of those decision points where a different decision could have been made. What's incomprehensible is how all of them could have been missed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Nuttall will have time to come back. Mr. Christofferson, please. You have 7 minutes.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I've been wrestling with this ever since we've received it, more in terms of where do we go as opposed to whether or not I agree. And I have to say that on at least 2 other occasions, this Auditor General has come to us with sort of macro messaging. I'm talking to colleagues now. One early on in the term was on data. And we committed ourselves as a committee unanimously that we were going to pick up that torch and run with it and that we were, every time we saw a data problem in any of the reports, we were going to pull that out and highlight it, and we were going to use this term to drill down that we're doing a lot of things right with data, but the key things we're not doing, such as keeping them up to date and doing proper analysis. The other that comes to my mind, Chair, is on do service well, which was, I believe, I stand to be corrected, but I think on the EI report, where we found the bureaucracy was measuring internal steps and was quite pleased with themselves in terms of the time frames of moving something along within the process, completely ignoring the fact that people were waiting on the phone 20 minutes to get an answer, only to be disconnected because the powers that be didn't want that call to be included as a completed call. And the Auditor General's point was, all that measurement really doesn't have any significant impact if at the end of the day the citizens who receive the service aren't getting the service. And he put it under the rubric of do service well. And now, for the third time in this Parliament, we've received another macro message that's telling us that, in the opinion of our Auditor General, that there are incomprehensible failures here, and more importantly, if we don't take some action, we collectively as a government, which we're a part of, making that government work as efficiently as possible. If we don't take those steps now, then someday in the very near future, there's going to be a committee sitting here that's going to have another set of incomprehensible failures. In fact, the Auditor General went so far as to say if the government followed up on every single recommendation that he made vis-a-vis Phoenix, we would still have incomprehensible failures in the future. So to me, the pressure is on us now. What do we do? And that's what I've been wrestling with, is like exactly what do we do? To do nothing, in my opinion, is not acceptable. To write a report that says nothing is not acceptable. The work that we have and the mandate of this committee is too important. Too many people are relying on us and the system that we have with the Auditor General and the Public Accounts Committee to make sure we address these kind of things. And I want to say this very clearly, because to me it's very important. I was one of those that was, didn't hide my reaction to the words of the Clerk of the Privy Council. However, in his remarks, he did say, by the way, he was telling us, I don't have any direct relationship with the deputy ministers, which is where this culture discussion needs to happen. So I was listening very carefully to the words from Mr. Wallace, who was the Secretary of the Treasury Board. And I got to tell you, colleagues, if that had been the initial response, what Mr. Wallace said in response to this report, as opposed to what the Clerk of the Privy Council said, my reaction would have been completely different. In fact, I would have been thrilled. Because without contradicting directly his colleague, the Clerk of the Privy Council, the Secretary of the Treasury Board, in my view, pretty much said, I hear you and I understand, and here's what I'll do. And you'll recall, colleagues, we pushed him. I, in particular, pushed him hard because I thought we were going to get another set of the Clerk of the Privy Council remarks, and I wasn't having it. Didn't happen. He gave what I thought were very good answers in recognizing that this is big, that it's system-wide, and that he took it very personal. Like, I was impressed. He said, look, I'm responsible, and my obligation is to get this fixed. So I got to tell you, colleagues, I'm going from the point of view, I'm going to pretend the Clerk of the Privy Council didn't even talk. He's entitled to his opinion, too. I'm far more concerned about what the Secretary of the Treasury Board, who has hands-on work with the deputy ministers and has actual oversight in terms of their challenge function and ensuring the Treasury Board guidelines are followed. So, having said all of that, to me, I think we should get down to what can we do, and I know I'm running out of time, so Clerk, whatever's left, forgive me for using all my time again, as I always do, but twice, Mr. Ferguson, you said, I quote, in today's remarks, it was intended to start a conversation about how government culture contributed to the Phoenix failure. In paragraph 13, but there has to be a conversation about the culture of government. So help Help me understand what you think we might be able to do to further that conversation, or start the conversation, or be a positive part of having that conversation take place. Your thoughts, Mr. Ferguson.
Ferguson, please.
Thank you. So like I say, what I was trying to do was I was trying to start the conversation, and I think I did that. And I appreciate that the committee is picking up on that, and I think, you know, I was also, quite frankly, I was happy with what the Deputy Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada said when it came to her conversation about needing to change the culture within her department and the need to allow people within her department to speak frankly. So I think we have seen a number of you know, already we've seen both of the people that were here, the Secretary and the Deputy Minister, talking about the need to make some changes to culture. The Secretary talked about the need to make sure that Treasury Board policies are implemented in substance, not just in form, which I think is right. I think one thing we need to consider in our work as well is maybe we have been too easy on Treasury Board in some of our audits. We have accepted, or Treasury Board Secretariat, we have accepted the Treasury Board Secretariat's role as sort of a policy maker, and I think maybe we need to be much more insistent on the fact that they also have a responsibility to make sure their policies are being implemented the right way. That doesn't mean they have to be holding departments' hands all the time, but they should have some way of knowing whether the policies are being accepted and implemented the right way. Just the last thing I will mention, and I don't know that you would want to do this, it was passed to me, and so I wasn't aware of this, it was passed to me just before the hearing. The House of Commons in the UK, their Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee have just put out a report called "The Minister and the Official: The Fulcrum of Whitehall Effectiveness." So there's a committee, you know, a parliamentary committee in you know, a Westminster culture like ours that in fact has studied this very question about how ministers interact with officials. So, you know, again, I don't know whether you want to do that type of a study, but at least looking at that report might give you some ideas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferguson. We're going into a summer break, and I can see members of the committee sitting around a campfire reading such reports. It might be good reading, or it might be cure for insomnia, but we'll take you up on that. We'll now turn to Mr. Lefebvre, please, for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again, Mr. Ferguson, for being here. A bit like Mr. Christopherson, when I saw the report, and obviously we heard the clerk of the Privy Council, and last week we had the panel that we had, and just, you know, I went back home and we thought hard about this thing. We're talking about an incomprehensible failure here, and I go back and I just look at the facts, you know, and I look at, in your report at paragraph, on the Phoenix, at paragraph 1.32, where you say that IBM, you know, basically the contractor said the budget for this would be around $274 million. Back in 2009, you know, PSPC had budgeted $155 million, and nothing changed. So that still budget of $155 remained, and then even though IBM said it was going to cost $275, there's a gap over $100 million. So when we say that there's an incomprehensible, you know, failure, to me it's very clear, and the answer is very direct. And again, but when we talk about culture, you know, the fact that nobody, or somebody, maybe, we're not sure, did not ask for more money or did not get more money, to me that's the gap that exists. If our bureaucrats, our public servants, do not have the ability or don't want to ask for, you know, the budget that they require to do the proper job to service Canadians, in this case their own colleagues, that is a culture of fear that exists, or that existed, or that may still exist today. And that to me is where the system fails. And for me, when I look at, again, at all the facts, that there's a gap, and nobody really, I find that we're kind of missing that fact. If I would say today, we'll embark upon a new project, but the project is going to cost anything $275 million, but we're only going to give you $150, and expect a different result, no matter what reports we get, what timelines we get, what structure we put in, we're going to get a failure, period. So to me, when I really take a step back and look at 10,000 feet up, if a project of this magnitude, of any magnitude, is not on budget, and you've also had many meetings that you had with us, I've told us about that, project management, right? You have timelines and budget and basically results. And if one of the things, one of these three elements does not really happen, it can lead to a result that may not be a positive one. And in this case, clearly, that is the case that has happened. So from what we've heard in the past 3 weeks and the recommendations that you've given, I'm just asking you, even if today we have a similar project, I don't think we're going to expect a different result. So how do we, as a committee, or even as Parliament, go back and ensure that that doesn't happen again? Because again, it's numbers that we're talking with. We've reduced this to numbers, not to the results. You said we should be focused on results. This was focused on budget, clearly. That's what, and these are the facts. So how do we go to change that? Mr. Ferguson.
Well, again, if you go back to that particular example of the budget compared to what IBM said it would cost to build the system. At that point in time, as I think I've said a number of times before, it was not just a question of needing to respect the budget. It was also saying that if they are going to reduce the functionality in the system by that much, enough to get the budget back from 274 to 155 million, then they should have gone back and they should have recalculated the business case as well. Because remember, when the project was approved, yes, it was approved at a certain budget level, but it was also approved with an expectation that it was going to return $70 million a year in savings. So as soon as they decided to reduce it from 274 to 155 million, at that point in time, to me, there was a decision point that the department needed to go back to Treasury Board and say one of two things. Either we need more money in order to deliver all of the functionality and get the $70 million a year in savings, or we will do it for less, we will cut back on some functionality, and we will not deliver the $70 million a year in savings. Now, hopefully in the course of that conversation, there would have been some questions about, well, what are you cutting back? And you're cutting back pilot projects and things like that. That doesn't sound like a good idea. Regardless, I think that there should have been a realization, and again, I don't know where that failure happened, but there should have been a realization that this wasn't just a question of the budget, this was also a question of the benefits that were supposed to come out of this system. And that's how I use the word incomprehensible in this. And I think at the last hearing, people were talking about the Gartner report, members were questioning about the Gartner report, and how was it that the Gartner report only went to the project executives and didn't go to other people. And I could just see heads shaking, when asking that question. People were asking, how did they decide to cut out a pilot project, which is a fundamental piece? And again, heads were shaking about how could they make that decision. So maybe I should have used the word that it was a head-shaking failure rather than an incomprehensible failure, because yes, I understand that, again, you can understand all the decision points, and the one that you mentioned about the budget is one of those decision points, but I'm using the word incomprehensible in the terms of people just can't understand how those decisions were made, and when you talk your way through it, all you see is people shaking their heads because they can't understand how those decisions were made.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lefebvre. Monsieur Deltel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Ferguson. Always a pleasure to see you. Before asking you 2 or 3 questions, I just want to pay on my respect for the way you're doing your things. Your reports are very directive. We know where you go. We know where you stand. We know what you fight for. We deeply appreciate that. And as a former journalist, I deeply appreciate that you give number to each and every paragraph of your statement. Very easy to refer to. Speaking of that, j'aimerais donc relever le fait.
I'd like to go back to what you said in your testimony today. There are two themes that we can draw from it. First, you talked about the culture of the public service that led to Phoenix, and then you talked about the root causes, which in your opinion led to the Phoenix fiasco. So these are the two themes that you mentioned today in your testimony. Now, I'd like to go back to what you said last week, paragraph 7, when the management responsible for Phoenix were informed by PSPC that the system was going to be launched. They did not mention serious issues that they were aware of. The decision to launch Phoenix was not documented. They did not mention serious issues. Chair, I'll always go back to this point. We can't make the proper decision if we don't have the right information. And worse still, if capital information, serious information was not disclosed, it leads to serious errors in decision, disastrous ones that we saw. So, based on this, when you say that people did not mention serious issues, in your opinion, is this part of the culture of the government or part of the root causes of the issues that we experienced with Phoenix? Mr. Ferguson. Of course, I think it's one of the root causes because the upper management responsible for Phoenix were aware of facts. They knew there were issues and there were serious risks related to this project. However, we also have to consider whether the reason they decided to not disclose these risks, were the reasons, were they part of this culture? So yes, it was a cause because the deputy minister did not have all the necessary information to understand the gravity of the situation and the risks with the system. But as I said, I think it's also important to consider whether there were cultural aspects in this decision as well that came into play.
All the interrogation that you did for this conclusion, do you think that this is part of the culture of the government to hide important information?
I certainly would not say that that happens every time. Obviously, though, in the case of Phoenix, in this situation, there was a decision not to bring that information forward. And as we said in the audit, there were very clear signals that Phoenix was not ready to launch, whether you look at what happened in Miramichi or other clear signals that it was not ready to launch. Yes, but for some reason, they decided not to bring that information forward.
Did you ask those some reasons?
I'd have to go back to the auditors to figure out exactly, who we asked of which questions. We certainly were trying to find out what information went forward. And again, we were only able to find that the information that went forward to the Deputy Minister was at a very high level, didn't talk about all of the risks, and essentially said that the system was ready to go.
Vous avez entendu la semaine dernière le témoignage.
Last week we heard testimony from the current Deputy Minister, who was not there when the switch on Phoenix was switched, but she said the 3 persons involved within the government, the 2 of whom are still within the public service in the same department, in the same place, physical location, they confirm that it wasn't their vision of the situation. Would you like to know more about what their vision is, the vision of these 3 people who don't seem to agree with the conclusions in your report? When we did our audit, we had many opportunities to obtain all the necessary information to provide our opinion on our objective. So we discussed things with these individuals. We discussed the various aspects and decisions and information that was available. Our practice is to gather all the information, and in our audit, we present everything we identified during the audit. So it's not a question of having a conversation or a specific conversation. The objective of an audit is to obtain all the information and find the message within this information. Thank you.
We'll be back and forth. Madam Mendez.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ferguson. I second the Chair's initial words to thank you for the enormous contribution you've brought to this committee and in all your reports. And I think you've certainly made us, as a committee, perhaps the most interesting committee in the House. So I want to say that to my colleagues, to tell them, you don't know how much fun we're having here. Yes. I also would like to go back to this, well, a bit of what the line of questioning Mr. Deltel was taking and what my colleague Mr. Lefebvre was saying too. It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've had some, through Facebook of all places, some public servants approach me, that one of the big problems the public sector now feels, or has felt for a few years now, is a total fear of going up to their superiors and telling them when things are not working exactly as planned. They are terrified of going up the hierarchy and announcing to their superiors that something is not going as planned. Did your team of auditors find this, or were they told or shared impressions about this?
Again, in the course of an audit, what we have to do is we have to follow the evidence and we have to follow the trail. And what we found was, again, that the information about the seriousness of the situation really didn't get past the people that were responsible for the project. And that's why we also called it a failure of oversight as well. There was no second check of the information that they were providing, no way of the deputy minister or anybody else knowing whether what the information those people were providing was reflective of the situation or not. So, again, I can't get to why they may have decided not to bring that information forward. I believe that it reflects something about the culture, and that's why I felt I had to write the message, is that there was more here than just, at this decision point they didn't make the right decision or there wasn't enough oversight. Again, it still comes back to the fundamental question of, with all of the controls that exist within the federal government, how was it that Phoenix was able to happen? So why that information didn't go forward, I don't know, but we saw very clear that the risks were known, the information should have been known about the fact that the system was not ready. Departments could have told, and did to a certain extent say that the system was not ready. Somehow it still went forward. Why, I don't know.
And I'm guessing again from messages I've received that a lot of this has to do with the very important fact that public servants are human beings and they have ambitions and they have professional aspirations. And if they are told that they have an objective to reach and that they have to deliver on that objective, and that if they don't, well, the promotion won't come or the bonus won't come or whatever the compensation would be, well, their natural instinct is to try to hide problems and to hide difficulties in attaining whatever objective was given to them. So what I'm trying to get at, is this possible? And like I told you, I have at least 3 messages from public servants directly on my Facebook Messenger of all places about these issues, about issues of fear of staff who were not comfortable or who actually felt that their career would be threatened if they went forward with alerts of things not going well, or just signaling that things were not going as planned. And is this part of something that we will have to address as a committee in the report we're going to make? Is this something that we should explore? I'm throwing it out there and seeing if you have heard complaints of the same nature.
Well, I think it's consistent, at least, with my observation that in some cases policy seems to be applied as a way to just say, look, the policy has been applied. So if the policy's been applied, then I have the plausible deniability, and if something goes wrong, well, I can say I followed the policy. So I think it is at least consistent with that. I don't know, to what extent it is fear, or if there is any fear, how widespread that might be. But I think that there is, I've come across, probably too many instances, and in the case of the Phoenix, it was again with the SI system report, how that was used to essentially say that they followed the policy of making sure there was an external evaluation of the project, when in actual fact it didn't have sort of the independence that it needed to actually reflect the substance of that policy. So I think it is, very, in my opinion, again, I think that we do see situations where the system becomes very focused on checking boxes and using policies as cover for making certain decisions.
Thank you, Ms. Mendez. Mr. Nuttall, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Auditor General. A couple of follow-up questions. How did the, and quickly, because I'm trying to cram a lot into this 5 minutes, how did the Gartner report come to be? Who communicated to the Treasury Board that this needed a look? Because there was some sort of failures or concerns or risks that were...
So I'm not sure if there was one person that communicated it, but certainly they were getting enough messages and hearing enough issues that they felt they needed to have the report done.
From who? From where?
I don't know the specifics of that. I don't know whether we have that in the course of the audit. It wouldn't have been something that we needed to know. All we needed to know was that the Gartner report was commissioned.
If you could look to see if that's information is available.
We'll do that.
The individuals who received financial awards after this was completed, were they the same individuals, or let me go back 1 second. Were there individuals who received financial awards related to the implementation of Phoenix?
Again, that's not something that I can speak to specifically. I think the Deputy Minister has mentioned some of that in the past, but that wasn't critical again to the audit that we did.
Would those individuals have been separate from the people who were providing information related to the risks associated with moving ahead with Phoenix?
Again, that's something the department would have to tell you. It was not information that we needed to look at in order to get to our opinions on the audit.
Is it plausible that the individuals who there's individuals who had information related to the launch of Phoenix who would also receive financial compensation for the launch of Phoenix? Withheld information in relation to the risks of Phoenix?
So, specifically, I don't know that. I think the Deputy Minister referred to, and you'd have to go back and double check, but I think she referred to the fact that there were not, that type of compensation was not given in the year of the launch of Phoenix, but I'm only going by memory on that. You'd have to refer back to her testimony.
Okay, I'll pass it over to my friend, Mr. Dittel.
For 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
2.5 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Ferguson, always a pleasure to talk to you. J'aimerais revenir sur le fond de la question.
I'd like to go back to the whole question of information that was not mentioned, serious issues that they were aware of. Also, secondly, the decision to launch Phoenix was not documented. Mr. Ferguson, you said that you found no trail in February that could have suggested that someone in power who signed off on an email or a document that said, yeah, let's move forward with Phoenix. Did I understand that correctly? Yes, you're right. Is this part of the government's culture that you're identifying as being one of the causes of the problem? There is no one who took the responsibility to say that, yeah, let's move forward. Once again, it's hard to say. if this was a cultural aspect or not. It was strange that we didn't find any recommendation to implement the system, because this is something we usually find for this type of project. But was it simply something that was forgotten, or was there another reason? I can't say. It's strange that as an MP, we have to sign off on every dollar that we spend. When I contribute $100 to a charity to support their work, I have to fill out a three-page document, and that's fine. I have nothing to say about that. But it's really amazing to see that we've implemented a multi-billion-dollar project when no one signed off on it. And that is why we've presented this in the conclusion of our audit. It's one of the key aspects with this type of project. You need to have someone sign off on the approval of such a project. Who should have signed this? The deputy minister or the minister? That depends. It's not the same person for all projects. It depends on the project. That's why I'm asking you, to the best of your knowledge, who should have signed off on the final, the minister or the deputy minister? Once again, no one was responsible directly in the charter of this project. In my opinion, it's something that would have been important at the beginning of the project to make the decision about who was responsible for improving the implementation of the project. But there was no documentation of this decision when the situation was approved and launched. Thank you.
Before we go to Mr. Area, in your report, you and I'll quote it, you says it's as if the Phoenix project was set up to avoid responsibility, and this is just kind of tagging along with what Mr. Deltel says, but you said it was like they were set up to avoid responsibility either by design or by accident. And there was no, as he mentioned, there was no documented approval by anyone that the system should be launched. Do you believe that it was deliberate, that there was no documented approval?
Again, that's trying to impute intention on people, which is not something that I can do. We would not have seen anything that indicated that it was intentional. So that's as far as I can tell you, is that it did not happen, and I can't point to anything that indicated that it was intentional.
But if, and again, that goes to what I would think would be the culture. Like, the culture would be that if there's no documentation, so that Minister Foote is not, or the DM is not aware, not even the political minister, but the minister of the department, but the DM, then you can't expect that the minister would know, and it might have been like that for a decade. Is that part of the culture?
Well, in this particular instance, a very important step, which is a normal step in the case of an information technology project and putting a new IT system in place, which is that final sign-off. We couldn't find the documentation of that final sign-off. So in the end, it's the only thing that you can say is because the project executives believed that the system was ready to launch, the system was launched, and there was no further identification of anybody else that needed to give that approval.
Do you believe that those three executives believed that it was ready to launch?
I certainly don't believe anybody would have launched this system if they really knew the mess it was going to end up being. So I think that they should have identified and they should have known with the issues that were known to them. They should have known the size of that problem. But, you know, again, I'm not, there would be nothing to indicate that they intentionally did that. And I think if, you know, if they had the hindsight to know what was going to happen, I think that they would not have made the decision to launch the system. But again, that's looking at it in hindsight.
Thank you. Mr. Area, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Public service has about 270,000 employees. Several thousand are executives. It's a massive, massive organization, the biggest employer in Canada. Yes, problems are natural because of the huge number. Projects do get failed. For Phoenix, coming to Phoenix, fundamentally there are two issues we can drill it down that caused this problem, and this was executed by 3 people. One is the project went ahead with just $155 million against the requirement $274 million. When you start this way, there is no way the project will come out as a success. Second, hundreds of compensations advisors were fired before the new system was fully functionally implemented. These are the 2 fundamental reasons, I believe, which led to the massive failure of this project. And how many people responsible? 3, maybe 4, maybe additional deputy minister. So, if this project failed basically due to 3 executives, maybe 1 more, and due to 2 fundamental reasons, is it fair to brush the entire public service in the same manner?
So my comments are not about the public servants themselves. My comments are about the fact that I believe that there is a culture problem that contributed to this. And again, yes, I agree with you on the 2 fundamental decision points that were the most obvious, that people could have identified that this was not going to work. And yes, we talk about the senior executives, but the cultural problem was, again, there was no oversight. There were other people that were aware of the problem. You know, that again, the Treasury Board Secretariat decided to do the Gartner report. There were departments that were saying this was not ready to work. The department originally planned to do 4 internal audits and didn't do them. All of those things meant that there were other places where this problem could have been identified, but it wasn't. So I don't think you can just say it was only isolated to 2 issues and 3 people.
I got it. Canadian public service is considered to be the best in the world. If not the best, at least one of the top 2-3 best public services in the world. How can it be the best in the world when, if we say that it's broken?
Again, it wasn't the public service that I'm trying to say is broken. It's that we are making them operate in a culture that can cause these types of incomprehensible failures. So I certainly believe we have, you know, that our civil service, the people that work here are second to none. But I think we also have to realize that something like Phoenix is going to tarnish that reputation.
You mentioned that there have been frequent changes at the deputy minister's level. Yes, in Phoenix, we found 3 deputy ministers in the span of 7 years. But the clerk of Privy Council said, I'm talking from memory here, the median term of a deputy minister is about 5 years. So, I don't know, do you have data to say that in general that there's a frequent change in deputy ministers?
Again, what I said in the message is that I think that the short tenure of deputy ministers contributes to these types of problems. So yes, you know, you can look at an average, and you know, and an average can cover up a lot of issues. But when you look at the fact that in terms of Public Services and Procurement Canada, now with the current deputy, that means there have been 4 deputies in a, you know, in let's say I don't know, a 7, 8, you know, even extended out to 10-year period. It's a short period of time. The deputy minister that was in place at the time of the decision had only been in that position for 1 year. So yes, I mean, we can use averages to say, well, look, the problem isn't as big as he's saying, but the problem is significant when you look at that department. I mean, you had both the Secretary of the Treasury Board and the Deputy Minister of PSPC here the other day, and both of them were saying, and rightly so, saying, I wasn't there when the problem happened. If I look at the last 4 Auditors General, for example, that goes back through my predecessor, Sheila Fraser. Before her, it was Denny Desautels. Before him, it was Ken Dye. That takes you back 40 years for 4 people.
No, I think our time is up. Your time is up, and I think our time is up. I've spoken to some of our vice chairs, and we want to leave a few minutes for committee business where we plan out how we draft a report from what we've heard. And so I will just, again, thank you for coming. Wish you a very good summer. Madam Mendez mentioned that she has received letters or Facebook messages from public servants. I can tell you that since we started doing this, we are also receiving letters. Good public servants, unquestionably, that also recognize there is a culture that needs to be repaired. And so I like the I like the way that you formatted it. This is not at all an attack on our public servants. This is the place where they work, the culture in which they operate, and how can we help improve that culture. And I can tell you that from what we've been hearing, the public servants are the ones cheering us on that we can indeed improve it. And so you have, I think, been honourable in your report to Parliament in your audits, and I am hoping that through this committee and through government ops and other committees, certainly it can be addressed. So we thank you for your attendance here today, and we will now suspend for a few moments. We'll ask all those to leave because this will go in camera, and we will discuss drafting a report. So thank you. We'll suspend.
Thank you.